the main building of the Omega Union. Here, a voice can be heard saying, "Boss, I haven't been on vacation in 3 years. I'm tired. Please don't give me any more assignments this month. I want to fly far away to the islands to relax. Yan Yi." The president of the Omega Union replies, "All you need to do is rescue the hostage. It won't take long." However, the brunette continues to resist. He shouted that he's going on vacation. That brunette was Bai Chunyuan, the White Lion, an alpha, and the head of the tactical division. Yan Yi decides to stop the guy by naming a price for his small job. The price is 200,000, but Bai Chunyuan insists that it's not about the money at all. Yan Yi came up with another idea to change the brunette's mind. He handed him his laptop and asked him to watch the video first and then make a decision. In this video, a blonde man was standing near a large aquarium, and he was told that they guaranteed this item was extremely rare. After all, no matter how hard he looked, he wouldn't find anything like it again. Bai Chunyuan asked thoughtfully, "Trafficking in living beings? He can't be saved now. He'll just die. That tank looks to be about 3 by 6 meters. By the time I get to him, he'll already be..." However, the brunette suddenly discovers something unbelievable, which leaves him shocked. This blonde guy had no legs at all. He had a tail. He was a merman. Yan Yi picks up a cup of tea and says, "As you can see, this isn't a person, but an extremely dangerous test subject. And according to our data, your scents are perfectly compatible." He then added, "But the most interesting thing is that half an hour ago, we received a message from him asking for help. He didn't say anything. We communicated using only Morse code. Don't you want to know what he tapped out?" Bai Chunyuan said thoughtfully, "White Lion, Bai Shi." A blonde man at the aquarium touched his cheek with his palm and said, "Bai Shi, as we were very valuable test subjects in the experiment, the merman Lan Bo and I were once kept in the same compartment so that the researchers could observe our behavior," Bai Chunyuan thought to himself. He recalls the image of Lan Bo and how that young man was very handsome and gentle. But as soon as Bai let his guard down, his heart immediately lost its peace. Bai Chunyuan was absolutely thrilled with this new neighborhood, until something terrible happened. By that point, Bai Chunyuan had already forgotten that mermaids were, by nature, a dangerous species. And not only that, but they possessed unprecedented combat power, yet were extremely unreliable as test subjects for experiments. Bai Shi was lost in his thoughts. At that moment, the Union president was trying to snap him out of it and was calling his name. Yan Yi walked over to the guy with brown hair and said, "Of course, it must be awkward for you that your ex is calling on you specifically to help out, but if you don't want to go, I won't force you." At that moment, Bai Shi replies that he's not her ex at all, they're just friends. After that, the brunette firmly asked the Union president to send him the guy's coordinates. Bai Shi said he was ready to head to Lan Bo right away, an abandoned aquarium. At this spot, 2 guys were closely observing the behavior of a fair-haired merman. Lan Bo pressed her palms against the glass and looked at the boys. At that moment, Rusala was wearing a special necklace around her neck. One of the guys touched the merman. He smiled slyly and said, "Look, we didn't touch his lovely little face, even though we made him suffer quite a bit." At that moment, the heavier-set man replied, "The Rusal Omega, it really is a rare find. I like it, and the price is just right. But this place..." Then the dark-haired guy with the ears on his head said, "Don't worry, there are 100 security guards on duty here, and we also have 2 second-tier alpha mercenaries. Not even a mosquito could get past them." One of the men suddenly concludes that he can smell a very strong, overpowering odor, and he immediately wonders where it's coming from. Just then, the walkie-talkie on one of the men in a jacket beeped, and a voice came through it. "Can you hear me? My Omega is very powerful, so if it's not too much trouble, just hand him over to me so he doesn't hurt you. This door is bulletproof. It's so thick. I keep knocking and knocking, but no one's opening it for me," the voice on the radio keeps saying. Everyone present was on high alert, but that didn't help them any more than their weapons did. The young man single-handedly broke down the door with ease and shoved the men aside. The dark-haired guy was shaking really badly and asked the guy who had just shown up, "Who is he anyway?" Bai Shi adjusts his gloves and introduces himself. As soon as Rusal saw him, he immediately tried to swim as close as possible. In the blink of an eye, Bai Shi pulled out a gun and fired right into the aquarium. At that moment, everyone watched the scene with concern and asked the guy what on earth he was up to. With a deft movement, Bai Shi tapped the glass with his pistol, causing a lot of water to spill out. And along with the water, the merman himself appeared outside. Lan Bo was trembling violently. Bai Shi looked down at Rusal from above and asked him if he was still alive. Lan Bo simply closed his eyes. He needed a little time to get used to the atmosphere. Bai Shi lifts his leg slightly and says, I used to be so fierce because you reminded me of my stomach, but now you've become so fragile. Suddenly, the brunette noticed something that took him by surprise. Lan Bo reached out and took Bai Shi's hand, looking at him with a pitying gaze. Bai Shi pulled his hand away. He wasn't particularly keen on that kind of physical contact. At that moment, the merman coughed a little, and he coughed up ketchup. And as soon as those feelings faded, Russell smiled and moved closer to Bai Shi. He squeezed the boy's hand again, their fingers intertwined, and Bai Shi didn't even mind. Bai Shi cast a close look at the mermaid. At that moment, the brunette's pupils narrowed. The boy's fingers intertwined in a tender touch. But after that, Bai Shi pulled his hand away from the merman again without much warning, which left the blonde man stunned. But suddenly, Lan Bo felt someone touch his shoulder, and the young man gave a start. It was Bai Shi. A moment later, he lifted Lan Bo into his arms and looked her straight in the eyes. The brunette realized just how cold this guy was. Bai Shi held Lan Bo's tail very tightly. He didn't want the boy to accidentally fall. Bai Shi recalls events that took place 3 years ago. To Bai Shi, Lan Bo seems just the same as he was back then. Now his body temperature is many times higher than that of an ordinary person. Even a single kiss was enough to burn him, causing him to start screaming immediately. Bai Shi recalls that after a couple or 3 drinks, he would start crying so hard that by morning you could have gathered pearls from his eyelashes. Right now, the blonde guy leaned his face closer to Bai Shi. Bai Shi was holding Lan Bo in his arms and asked, puzzled, who did this to him? He then said, in an even quieter voice, find him. Lan Bo pulls out a gun and looks at it closely. When the merman looked in the direction of one of the man held out his hand and shouted loudly that it wasn't him and that he had nothing to do with it at all. Lan Bo didn't even want to hear him out. He immediately aimed at the man and was ready to shoot. In just a moment, the merman takes this man's life. It all happened very quickly and noisily. In the end, the guys were about to leave the place together. But on their way to the door, Russell, sitting on Bai Shi's shoulders, began shooting the men one by one. A little time passed. Bai Shi and Lan Bo found themselves alone together. At that moment, the dark-haired man looked down at the floor. He never would have imagined that the mermaids could implant a gland suppressor. Soon, Bai Shi whispered to the blonde man to stay still, since she wanted to help him. At that moment, Bai Shi bit the blonde man on the neck and with a sharp movement, pulled out the metal suppressor that was embedded in his neck. Lan Bo, Electric Sea Devil, Omega. His gland pressure has now been resolved. The mermaid has her own unique ability. It's called the differentiating ability of the descending assault current, and Lan Bo was particularly skilled at handling electricity. Bai Shi carried Lan Bo in his arms for quite a while longer. They stopped next to a cool motorcycle, and just then, the dark-haired guy pulls a pocket bomb out of his pocket. Bai Shi gets on the motorcycle with the merman, and before driving off, he throws a bomb and immediately speeds away, all the while thinking that such illegal sales points must be destroyed. Bai Shi and Banli were driving at high speed, with massive explosions behind them. Lan Bo was very surprised when he heard them. Meanwhile, Bai Shi said, let's go. We need to get out of this hole as soon as possible. 2 hours later, at Bai Shi's house, the sound of a news broadcast can be heard. An explosion rocked the southern part of the city this afternoon. The number of casualties has not yet been determined. It is reported that the explosion was caused by an aquarium that suddenly burst, which led to a short circuit in an outdated power supply circuit, the journalist reports. Meanwhile, Bai Shi is happily munching on chips. She and Lan Bo are watching TV together. While Lan Bo is staring at the screen, Bai Shi is listening to the news, but she's paying most of her attention to a bag of chips. Soon, Bai Shi looks over at Russell and says, your bandages have soaked up a lot of water. Take them off and stop wetting the floor. However, Lan Bo didn't understand a word of what was said. He looked at the dark-haired man in confusion and asked in his own language, what? Bai Shi turns his head toward the merman. The guy was really angry and asked, if you can't speak, just keep quiet. Or do you think this makes you seem cuter? Lan Bo continues to look at the guy with a puzzled expression. But soon, Lan Bo began to understand the meaning of certain words. Specifically, you're cute. He was delighted to hear this from the person he was talking to. Lan Bo smiled broadly, and a slight blush appeared on his cheeks. He later told Bai Shi that he was very cute too. Bai Shi stared at the merman in indignation. The guys kept watching TV. Then Bai Shi started to wonder what the merman was up to, since he was acting that way. Lan Bo furrowed his brow and looked ahead more intently. Suddenly, he grabs the bottle and bites into it, as if it were some kind of food. Baisha folded his arms and said, Lan Bo, in an irritated tone. Baishi suggested that the guy go with him to the bathroom. Then, without waiting for an answer, he grabbed the blonde guy by the hair and started dragging him along, while Lan Bo continued to gnaw on the bottle. Lan Bo sighed heavily and resigned himself to his fate of having to go to the bathroom right now. A few seconds passed, and the guys found themselves in the bathroom, which was quite spacious. Baisha picks up the shower head and looks the blonde straight in the eyes. He turns on the shower head, and the stream of water flows directly onto the mermaid. Lan Bo sits quietly in his spot, with water slowly flowing over him. But after his bath, Lan Bo notices Baisha taking out a pair of scissors and starting to cut the bandages on his arms. Taken by surprise, the merman froze in place. When Lan Bo had regained his composure a little, he began to struggle to break free, unwilling to let Baisha do as he pleased. However, the dark-haired man asked him to calm down and stay still. With a deft movement, Baisha grabbed both of Rusala's hands, raised them above the blonde man's head, gripped his wrists tightly, and began cutting off the bandages. Baisha ran his scissors along the merman's hands, causing him to be greatly frightened. Lan Bo has no choice but to strike the brunette with his long tail, since he doesn't care for such shenanigans with scissors. Baisha froze in his tracks. He hadn't expected this behavior at all. Baisha spoke Rusal's name aloud and looked at him with a gaze. While Lan Bo looks away, he has absolutely no intention of conforming to the rules set by Baisha. But Rusal still turns her gaze toward the dark-haired guy and asks him, "Huh?" While the guy tilts his head slightly. Baisha clenched his hand into a fist and continued to stare at Rusal, which puzzled Lan Bo. Baisha tosses the bandage aside and says, "It hurts to have to help you. Why don't you just figure it out on your own?" Baisha himself leaned over and thought to himself, and yet he is a deep water fish. Even though the wet bandages keep moisture on his skin, he simply must be in the water. Baisha came up with a temporary solution. He grabbed Lan Bo by the tail and carried him over to the washing machine, deciding that this was the best option for now, and that in time, Baisha would be ready to buy the guy a proper aquarium. It was no trouble at all for Baisha to stuff the mermaid into the washing machine, since it was large and spacious enough. Baisha asks the blonde guy to sit in the washing machine and relax, while he himself plans to leave. Lan Bo rested his palms on the side of the washing machine, muttered, "Huh?" and watched Baisha walk away. Baisha returned to his room. He turned on the TV and started watching the news. He heard, "At this moment, the death toll continues to rise." According to the investigation, signs of wear and tear on the electrical circuits were found at the scene. No signs of human interference were found. However, this wonderful pastime is interrupted by a phone call. It's the boss calling. Baisha sighed heavily, picked up the phone, and answered it. Then he heard Yan Yi ask, "Where are you?" Baisha replied briefly, saying that he was at home. Yan Yi said with concern, "Did you really bring that test subject home, and even remove his iron suppressor without authorization?" To Yan Yi, this seemed like an extremely foolish act. Baisha replied that that was indeed the case, and then asked, "So what? I had one of those suppressors too, and it hurts like hell." Yan Yi fixes her hair and asks, "Do you even know how dangerous he is? Do you want me to put out a warrant for his arrest?" Suddenly, Baisha noticed that at that very moment another guy had called him. It was Lu Shangjin. Then the guy turns to his boss and says politely, "Boss, Uncle Jin is calling me right now, so I'm going to hang up. It must be something urgent. I'll call you back." At that moment, Yan Yi shouts in exasperation, "Bai Chun Yuan!" Baisha hangs up on Yan Yi and picks up the phone, asking, "Hello, is something wrong, Uncle Jin?" Then Jin decides to get straight to the point. "Yes, there's one thing I need your help with." Baisha raised his eyebrows and asked, "So that's what you want? So I can help your son pass the exam?" Baisha was very surprised. Then he objected, "I don't think that's a good idea. What am I supposed to do if these kids start crying after just one kick?" Jin asks the guy to just play along with them, not show his strength, and pretend to be a fool. Baisha agreed, but also added that he would like to ask Uncle Jin for something. The dark-haired guy furrowed his brow and said that he was listening carefully. Baisha stood up and said, "I have a friend who got himself into a bit of trouble and is now hiding at my place, and the boss wants to arrest him. He's a good fighter, and your son's team is short on people right now. Can I take him with me?" Baisha replies that his friend has no legs, so it's a little difficult for him to get around. Uncle Jin adjusted his tie and said he felt sorry for the disabled man, then added, "All right, no problem. I'll talk to Yan Yi. He's already disabled, so what's the point of keeping the child? It's unfair." Baisha said, "Uncle Jin, something's come up, so I can't talk anymore." Bai Shi abruptly opens the bathroom door. He notices a merman resting in the washing machine, surrounded by a multitude of bubbles. Bai Shi was horrified. He had only stepped away for a minute, and already the place was such a mess. Bai Shi walks closer to the washing machine and turns off the button that created all those bubbles. The brunette is trying with all his might to keep his composure. Lan Bo was scared. He cowered, pretending he had nothing to do with it. Bai Shi asked the merman angrily, "Why did you pour so much powder?" As he asked this question, the young man pointed at the powder with his index finger. Lan Bo looks at him in confusion and says, "Kwa," again in her own language. Bai Shi clenched his hand into a fist. He was furious and said, "I unplugged the machine on purpose. How on earth did you even turn it on?" Lan Bo kept staring at the dark-haired man. At one point, without even realizing it, he fired a bolt of lightning from his tail. Bai Shi shouted and asked Lan Bo to control his powers. Lan Bo was greatly unsettled by such loud shouts. Soon, Bai Shi grabbed Lan Bo by the arm and said in a firm tone, "If you pull a stunt like that one more time, I'll kick you out. I won't have anything to do with you anymore." Lan Bo blushed deeply and looked at Bai Shi with an innocent expression, pretending he wasn't to blame for anything. Bai Shi picked Lan Bo up, lifting him out of the washing machine, after which the dark-haired man said, "Looks like I'll have to buy you a really big aquarium after all. One big enough to fit even a whale." Soon, Bai Shi made his way into the living room and laid the blonde man down on the cozy couch. Bai Shi looked the guy straight in the eye and said in a firm voice, "I ordered some food, so when you hear the doorbell ring, just open the door to receive the delivery." Lan Bo blushed deeply and shook his head. Bai Shi himself picks up a mop, wipes his forehead, and says he hasn't had a moment's peace since the mermaid showed up at his house. Bai Shi went into the bathroom and is now busily mopping up the puddles on the floor near the washing machine. Suddenly, he heard the doorbell ring, so he turned to Lan Bo and said, "Lan Bo, it's the delivery person. Open the door." However, the guy didn't hear a reply, so he called out to Rusal again. The brunette found it suspicious that it had suddenly become so quiet. It occurred to her that Rusal had gone outside to meet the courier. However, when the dark-haired man glanced toward the front door, he noticed the delivery person and Lan Bo, who had bitten the guy. Bai Shi was shocked. At that moment, he whispered, "Lan Bo." Bai Shi shouted again. He reached out his hand and apologized to the delivery person, explaining that this was his younger brother and that he'd been a little strange ever since he was a child. Bai Shi took the order from the delivery person and, smiling awkwardly, said that his brother had strange eating habits. The delivery person, meanwhile, was trembling with fear and wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. As soon as Bai Shi took the order, the courierist left without delay, while Bai Shi himself gritted his teeth. He was very angry at Rusal. He said, "Lan Bo," and then the merman tensed up very tightly. He had a bad feeling. Bai Shi shot the young man a stern, piercing look, then sighed heavily. Bai Shi closes his eyes and thinks that this is exactly what he should have expected from Rusal. He tries not to yell at the blonde guy unnecessarily. Instead, he touches Rusal's head and strokes it, thinking to himself that Lan Bo has never lived outside the lab before. After all, he simply knows nothing about the outside world. Lan Bo was grateful to the young man for the calmness and friendliness he had shown him. In response, Bai Shi clasped his hand. Bai Shi sadly realizes that this young man was raised for one purpose only, to fight and bring destruction to this world. On top of that, he was forced to give his life to an even more perfect fighter. Bai Shi thinks that he has simply fallen in love with the idealized image of Lan Bo. These memories really warm the brunette's heart and soul. They're filled with nothing but the best moments. However, Bai Shi now realizes that both he and Lan Bo were simply used in the past to achieve a goal. After all, even those few joyful moments they shared, even those took place under someone else's watchful eye. And those men continued to watch the guys having a good time together, even when everything was going as it should. They kept a close eye on the amount of odors being released. Bai Shi speculated that perhaps Lan Bo had been born without feelings, so the concept of betrayal doesn't exist for him at all. As she pondered this, Bai Shi felt the hatred in her chest subside a little, but she still felt she couldn't let this guy go. And even if he can't let him go, not as a lover, but simply as a good friend, Bai Shi thinks that if they were just friends, that would be fine too. Bai Shi believes that 48 hours will be enough to prove to President Yang that Lan Bo is by no means a dangerous test subject who could easily get out of control. Bai Shi is ready to do everything he can to help Lan Bo get a job at Omega. And in the future, when they become co-workers and spend time together, they certainly won't be bored. Bai Shi stretches and tells the merman that he will take him along tomorrow and that they will return in 2 days. Lan Bo then looks curiously in the direction of the dark-haired man. Bai Shi turned his head toward him and said, Uncle Jin's son has a tactics exam tomorrow. I'm going to help him secure a spot in the top 3. There's an open spot on the team, so I'll take you with me. Lan Bo replied with a brief, uh-huh. Bai Shi also added, this test is kind of like a game. You don't have to fight. Remember, you don't have to do anything. Just let me know where you are and that's it, says the dark-haired man, raising his finger. However, Lan Bo didn't grasp the meaning of those words. It seemed to him that Bai Shi was saying he would have to fight, so the merman fell deep in thought. A thought struck the young man. He clenched his fists and looked ahead with hope. Bai Shi looked at Lan Bo. He had a bad feeling about this guy. He seemed a little too smug. Exam arena. It was very crowded and noisy here today. Everyone had gathered to show off their skills. 2 guys were sitting in the stands. Lu Yang said, last night my father. He said he has a second cousin who's also going to take the exam, and he's going to bring some disabled guy along with him. Bai Langsing, a childhood friend, and also Lu Yang's lover, Anchar. Alpha patted Lu Yang on the head and tried to cheer him up. It's okay, go ahead and fight, I'll protect you. Lu Yang puffed out his cheeks and replied, blushing, 4 people should work as a single unit, but we're not a team. We're just 2 people with a trailer, and we're completely clueless. Suddenly, Lu Yang realized that someone had approached them. He was especially surprised when he saw the mermaids. Bai Shi was wearing stylish sunglasses. He raises his hand and greets the guys. At that moment, Lan Bowie has a rubber band in her mouth and is about to tie all her hair back into a ponytail. Lu Yang turned to his friend and asked, Lanxing, this alpha guy, he talks like some kind of playboy. Then Lanxing asked the guy what he meant by that. Lu Yang answers this question philosophically. His voice is kind of soft, but at the same time slightly hoarse, as if he hasn't quite woken up yet. Basically, he sounds like a chain-smoking Casanova. Bai Shi turned to the guys and told them that neither he nor Lan Bo had ever taken this exam before. He said he was counting on their help. Bai Shi takes off his glasses and says, we're still pretty weak, so let's try not to get in Brother Lu's way, okay? When Lu Yang heard this, he began to panic even more. Suddenly, the guys hear someone ask them, hey, what's your team's name? Some other guys approached the group, and their leader said mockingly, if we happen to meet in the arena, we won't beat you up, so you won't be humiliated and eliminated on the very first day. Bai Shi smiled and said, what's the difference? He let those guys just beat him up, no matter what. Lu Yang stepped between Bai Shi and the leader of that group and declared loudly, you think you're the toughest guy here, huh? Spouting all that crap right before the exam? You're just making a fool of yourself. Did your mom not love you enough when you were a kid or something? You're from the Whistle of the Wind team, aren't you? I remember you, so don't you dare follow us. And if you end up in the same zone as us, I'll blow your brains out. Bai Shi hurried to calm Lu down so he wouldn't say anything he shouldn't. Bai Shi suggests that everyone head over to the arena entrance together. Bai Shi was puzzled when he found out that their team had been named Who Cares Just Hit It. He didn't understand why they'd chosen that as their name. Lan Bo points to the system, and then Bai Shi realizes that it was an awkward coincidence. When that silly argument broke out, the very first words Bai Shi blurted out were automatically recognized by the system. One of the guys puts on his uniform and asks Bai Shi what their team is ultimately called, but Bai Shi feels awkward answering. He'd like to change the name if possible. But then Bai Shi realized that it wasn't possible and decided to just forget about the name and leave it as it was. Lan Bo continued to act as usual. This time, he took Bai Shi's glasses and started chewing on them. Bai Shi is trying to concentrate on the exam. He says, well, shall we hurry up and get into battle mode? Just give us chicks a little time to get used to it? As he says this, Bai Shi hands Lan Bo a pair of VR goggles. Bai Shi himself immersed himself in virtual reality. A thought crossed Bai Shi's mind. Wow, this is a fully immersive virtual reality experience. Is this test really that advanced? Bai Shi hears the words, welcome participants. We're glad to see you here for the advanced level team combat exam. Please familiarize yourselves with the rules. The rules are as follows. Attach the detonators to your belt and complete your mission within the allotted time. Otherwise, you will be destroyed by automatic detonation. For every 10 opponents you kill, you are awarded 1 star. To pass the exam, you must have 3 stars. Bai Shi sensed that he was feeling somewhat anxious. He was most worried about Lan Bo. I thought it was necessary to find him, so he also followed along as per the rule. Bai Shi thought for a moment. He realized he needed to earn 3 stars. As he recalled, Uncle Jin had told him not to stand out, but he needed to help this little bunny get higher grades. so 5 or 6 stars would be enough. A voice announced to the participants that the exam had begun. Then Bai Shi looked around the room. Bai Shi decides to find Lan Bo right away, since she's very worried about him. At that moment, Lan Bo was at one of the local fountains. After all, that was just the way he was. He was drawn to water. Behind the guy were 2 other guys. One of them was raising a knife, already anticipating the taste of victory over his opponent. Bai Shi was alarmed when he came across this scene. Then the second guy also pulls out his sword and starts swinging it. But the merman isn't as easy to deal with as he seems. It shot up out of the water, so when the guys saw its long, magnificent blue tail, they exclaimed, "A fish? No, a mermaid?" Lan Bo dived into the water with a sudden movement. It all happened so fast that the guys didn't even have time to react. Then he surfaces and with a sudden flick of his wrist, slashes the guy's carotid arteries, leaving them no chance of victory. Now all players hear the announcement, "Just attack." Lan Bo has executed Zheng Ju, and just attack. Lan Bo has executed Mo Fei. Exam score +1. Bai Shi hurried toward Lan Bo, calling out the merman's name even before he had a chance to reach him. Bai Shi approached the guy. I asked him not to move. Bai Shi touched the merman's face and examined it closely, trying to determine if there were any injuries on his body. Soon, Bai Shi moves even closer, coming face to face with Lan Bo, and asks in a concerned tone, "Only show yourself when I ask you to. The rest of the time, you'd better stay hidden somewhere out of the way so no one can find you." Lan Bo replied with nothing more than an A, at which point Bai Shi thought to himself, "This fish never obeys orders. Getting 5 or 6 stars for the rabbit, it's easier than eating steamed turnips, but keeping Lan Bo from scoring more than 7, now that's a problem." Bai Shi lowered his head and said, "By the way, it seems your pronunciation has become much clearer than it used to be. Say, Bai Chu, Nian again." Bai Shi touched the merman's cheek, and the merman said in a slightly uncertain voice, "Bai." Bai Shi smiled and asked the blonde man not to rush, then repeated his name syllable by syllable again. Lan Bo tried very hard. He pronounced the syllables Bai, Shu, Ni. Bai Shi runs his fingers over the merman's lips, and the merman puts on a serious expression and repeats, Bai. Bai Shi moved closer to the blonde man and asked the merman, "Forget it. Let's go with something simpler. Call me Brother Chu." Then Lan Bo spoke those words. It seemed it really was easier for him to say it that way. Bai Shi praised Lan Bo and asked him to keep practicing. At that moment, the 2 boys' eyes met. Bai Shi placed her hands on Lan Bo's shoulders and leaned forward slightly, moving even closer to his face. Bai Shi said the mermaid's name in a gentle voice. At that moment, a blush spread across the brunette's cheeks. Lan Bo continued to look Bai Shi in the eyes and didn't look away. Lan Bo touched the brunette's lips, then pulled away. Bai Shi said sheepishly, "It's you. If we weren't taking an exam right now, I would..." To which Lan Bo simply replied, "Hua." Yan and his friend approached the couple and said, "You haven't even finished the task yet, and you're already hiding out here from everyone, just chilling. You're just sitting on Yan's neck with your legs dangling." Yan noticed Lan Bo. He pushed past Bai Shi and told the merman, "Who would have thought you were this cool? You're coming with me on the next mission." Lan Bo was taken aback by these words. Bai Shi pulled the mermaid close and with a smile on his face, declared that Lan Bo would not go with Lu Yang. "Bai Shi," I said, "I understand perfectly well that if we let the mermaid run wild and kill at will, not even half the contestants in the arena would survive." Lu Yang stated that Bai Shi hadn't done anything at all, so he should step aside and not get in their way. Lanqing calms the guys down and asks them to go and complete their assignments. Instead of pointless arguments, some time has passed. Bai Shi casually keeps saying, "Everything's fine, just keep shooting, even if you empty the whole magazine. The ammo's free here anyway." Lu Yang looks at the brunette and replies sharply, "Yes, but there are more and more of them." Meanwhile, Lan Bo continues out of habit to sweep everything in his path. Lu Yang turned to Bai Shi and shouted, "What on earth are you doing? Is this your way of getting back at me or something?" Bai Shi, meanwhile, was just sitting there doing nothing. Lu Yang kept shouting. This time, he yelled that the enemies were getting closer and closer and that they would be driven back very soon. Bai Shi said in a calm voice, "Captain, let me have your M25. Lu Yang handed the rifle to Bai Shi. Lu Yang crossed his arms and said, "Do you even dare to stick your head out? 2 members of the opposing team have our window in their sights." Bai Shi smiled and asked the young man to be quiet, telling him to just watch. Bai Shi took aim, squinting slightly. The guy spotted his target and immediately pulled the trigger. He quickly took out his opponent. Bai Shi laughed, because no one believed in him, but he proved that he was capable of great things. After that, he tossed the M25 to Lion, saying, "Here, take this." The guy picked Lion Bo up in his arms and began climbing down from the window with him. With a smile on his face and a look of confidence in his eyes, Bai Shu said, "Let's go. We'll show them what no one survives really means." The guys boldly head downhill, and in the blink of an eye, several of their rivals are already collapsing, completely exhausted. Yan turns to Lanson and says, "Wow, it turns out they have so many supplies." The guy was genuinely surprised. After that, he suggested to his friend that they go take a look at what interesting things these guys had managed to dig up. Lu saw the loudspeaker. He started to wonder what they were going to do with it. Bai Shi shouted into the loudspeaker, "Dude, next time pick a better name for the team." Lu Yang felt that they were just wasting what little time they had instead of completing their tasks. Library. Archives room. The location of the first assignment. Bai Shi and Lion Bo are sitting on the floor, and Bai Shi is thinking, "File A, sort through the documents? Nothing too complicated. I might as well take a little break." In one of the documents, the guys read, "Special Operations Weapons 15 to 13, Reconnaissance Log." On the 25th, we placed the test subjects in the breeding chamber, where a variety of scents had been released. However, despite this, Subject 15-13 refuses to produce offspring with the omega we prepared. He appears very shy. After reading this information, Bai Shi realized that it was a log of observations from an experimental breeding program. He was no stranger to this process. Bai Shi sadly closes his eyes, lost in his own thoughts, while Lion Bo watches him with concern. Bai Shi recalls the words of scholars from the past. "We've finally found our dear Omega. He's so cute, I swear, his beauty. He's definitely a creation of God. He's simply beyond any aesthetic norms." Another scientist remarked, "Thank heaven and earth that it was to the liking of Subject 15-13. He slowly approached it and finally touched it. What a pity that things didn't go any further." After a while, the scientist exclaimed, "My God, look at that! They haven't even fallen in love yet. Just look at those loving glances. I can tell we'll have little ones soon. Their children will be our best test subjects." Each of their agonized cries will serve the cause of scientific and technological progress, another scientist confirmed. Now that Bai Shi has snapped out of his reverie, he opens his eyes, which reveal distinct traces of horror. Lion Bo watches his friend with concern and says, "Brother Chu?" Bai Shi lowers his head and asks Lion Bo not to worry, saying that everything is fine. Bai Shi thinks that, no matter what, at least for now, Lion Bo is still by his side, within his reach, so he should be happy. Bai Shi hugs Lion Bo tightly. The most important thing is that they have each other. All other problems can be solved. Bai Shi noticed that Lion Bo, as was his habit, was chewing on something again. So he gently pushed the merman away from him and asked him what he was chewing on. It didn't take long for Bai Shi to realize that Lion Bo had simply taken the documents that were supposed to be sorted and eaten them. A tear rolled down the guy's cheek because he just can't stand it. Suddenly, a voice rang out. "Random tasks. Who cares? Just beat Lion Bo. Sort papers, A, done. Sort papers, B, done. Destroy papers, C, done." Then Bai Shi began to ponder that last phrase. Bai Shi was happy. He walked over to Lion Bo and said, "Well, now you're my legendary koi carp. You bring good luck too." Lion Bo breathed a sigh of relief. He was glad they weren't mad at him anymore. Bai Shi picked up the merman and looking at him said, "The others aren't done yet, so let's go up to the roof for now and bask in the sun a little. Let's take a break." Right now, the voice of the exam proctor is announcing to the participants who was eliminated and who won. Bai Shi looked up and thought for a moment. He realized that from the start of the exam until now, the Ghost Hunters team had already killed 30 people, which meant they shouldn't be underestimated. Bai Shi thinks they've run into some pros this time. These guys definitely won't give up without a fight, the dark-haired man surmised. And it looks like they'll have to really work hard from here on out. Bai Shi crouched down next to the merman and asked him if he wanted to fight, while Lion Bo crawled closer to the dark-haired man and made a goo sound. Lion Bo stood in front of Bai Shi, and then Bai Shi asked the blonde man, "Are you trying to protect me because of what I said earlier?" Bai Shi thinks that Lion Bo is unfamiliar with modern technology and doesn't understand that this is all virtual reality. To him, it all looks like a real battlefield. Bai Shi approached Lion Bo and said, "Have you already forgotten how you once ruthlessly wounded me just to secure a spot in the breeding chamber, specifically with me?" Bai Shi looks away and says, he still remembers the events of that day. Bai Shi paused for a moment, then said, "Even with such extraordinary abilities, You were still going to turn against me. Yet I plan to step aside so you can escape and be free. The blonde man uttered, Choo, choo. Baisha added, Lanbo, I don't need to worry so much, and besides, he doesn't have to be so cruel. Baisha moved closer to the blonde man and asked him what he would do if he tried to escape, and Baisha sent him back. Baisha pressed his forehead against Lanbo's and asked, Do you like me? Lanbo let out a long, ah. Liu Yang, who had heard all this, asks the dark-haired man why he's making fun of the merman, who can't even give him a proper answer. Baisha smiles and replies, Little bunny, you shouldn't get involved in grown-up matters. My wife will learn everything in time. Liu Yang was very surprised that the guy was calling Rusal his little wife. Liu Yang suddenly moves closer to the merman and urges him to run away, since this madman wants to make him his wife. Liu Yang grabbed the merman and ran off with him as far away as possible, while Bai Shi watched in bewilderment. Bai Shi asks the kids to be careful, since he noticed something was wrong. Suddenly, there was a very loud noise, and the guys barely managed to dodge it. If they'd been just a few seconds later, they would have been engulfed in flames. Bai Shi turned to the guys and told them there was a sniper in the distance. Liu Yang cheerfully replied that he understood perfectly. Liu Yang raised his rifle and tried to take aim to hit the sniper. However, he didn't succeed. On the contrary, the sniper hit him right in the chest and ketchup gushed out of him. Bai Shi shouted loudly and told the guy not to stick his head out, since it looked like there was someone else there besides the sniper. Lanbo was holding a rifle and taking aim, while Liu Yang was trying to come to his senses. Bai Shi says, This is the Greyhound team we had a run-in with before entering the arena. Lanbo, take care of them. Bai Shi also mentioned that Lanbo is a good long-range shooter and is very skilled with any weapon. However, even Lanbo got hit, and ketchup ran down his body. Bai Shi grew concerned for his friend and asked him to take cover. Lanbo complied with his request. Lanbo was so badly injured that ketchup even started dripping from his mouth. Bai Shi looked at his friend and grew even more anxious. The situation was critical. Then Bai Shi said, I'll cover for you. Lanbo, crawl over to the chair. And, you take your rabbit. A man's voice could be heard nearby. Bai Shi looked in the direction the sound had come from. He got ready to shoot just in case. Bai Shi extends his arms forward and aims at his opponent, saying, Hit each one with a restorative. And a loud explosion rings out. Someone asks Bai Shi if they're going to break through, and Bai Shi replies, Wait, while we're recovering, those guys are sure to take the opportunity to kill us. The rabbit is currently receiving active treatment, as it had sustained fairly serious injuries. Lanbo was very scared. He grabbed his tail and squeezed it tightly, trembling violently as he did so. Someone asked Bai Shi, Doesn't he want to calm the merman down? After all, he is the alpha. Bai Shi replied, The wound isn't fatal. He'd better think about why the sniper targeted him specifically. Lanbo hung his head, lost in thought. He wondered why everything had turned out this way. He was still in intense pain. Bai Shi looked at Lanbo and reflected on the fact that it had only been 3 years since he'd last seen the merman. But in that time, the merman had become such a fool. The green-haired guy told Yan that. He said he was ready to keep him company. As he spoke, he was holding a rabbit, and the rabbit itself said, You keep an eye on your wife. I'll go teach those fools a lesson. I'll show them how a real man behaves. In the end, the two guys head downstairs, ready to claim victory. Yan is still feeling a little under the weather, but he pulls out his rifle and begins to take aim. Suddenly, a notification comes in saying that Liu Yang killed Xiaozhe, the whistle of the wind. Liu Yang was very composed. He smiled broadly and continued to listen to the notifications. The second one stated that he had killed Xiao Yao, and the third one stated that he had killed Xiao Qi. When Bai Shi heard this news, he thought that the little rabbit was actually strong. Just then, a sniper crept up behind Bai Shi. It was Xiaoxun, Greyhound, and Omega. However, Bai Shi was faster and more agile. He was the first to grab the sniper, from behind no less, and pressed his hand against the man's neck, saying, Look who we have here, little pup. You thought you could get away? Come on over here. Bai Shi gripped the guy tightly around the neck, not letting him get away. Bai Shi pressed the guy's head against the wall and pointed his gun at him. At that moment, he said, You're the last one left from the team. I'm counting on you now. If you want to live, don't move. But the guy says that Bai Shi might just shoot him. Bai Shi took the guy hostage and asked, I can see you're fearless, but whether you believe me or not is up to you. The guy tried to push Bai Shi away and aim his gun at him, but Bai Shi stopped him with little effort. Bai Shi asked, Weren't you the one who opened fire on our team and hit the kid? 1 shot, 1 dead body, buddy. Let's see if you've got the nerve to handle it. Let's go. Take those 3 scum in your team. Maybe you'll manage to hold out for another couple of days. The guy was surprised as soon as he realized the gun was no longer pointed at him. In a shocked voice, he asked, "Could it be that Bai Shi has decided to let him go?" Bai Shi doesn't say anything and just walks away, thinking that this is just a test. He just wanted to make fun of him, and there's no point in killing this guy. Bai Shi looked under the table and saw a sad merman. He simply lowered his gaze and sat there in silence. Out of fear, Lan Bo even curled up into a ball. Bai Shi felt awkward looking at him like that. Bai Shi fell into thought. Even though the exams took place in virtual reality, the pain from the injuries was no different from the real thing. So it was obvious that Lan Bo's body had activated its defense mechanisms. Lan Bo was very weak. Bai Shi helped him to his feet, then hugged him tightly and said, "It's okay. Everything's fine. None of this is real. If you're in pain, just let me hold you." After a brief embrace, the guys are standing face to face again. Soon, they sat down. Lan Bo touched the scales on his tail and began to peel them off one by one, then showed them to Bai Shi. Bai Shi was puzzled. He didn't understand why this was necessary, so he asked Rusal. Lan Bo didn't say anything. He just pointed to his tail again and pulled out another scale. After that, he began to peel off the scales one by one and hand them to the brunette. Bai Shi grew worried. A cold sweat broke out on his face, and he asked the guy to stop pulling them out, since he might end up with his tail exposed. But soon it dawned on Bai Shi. He realized that the fish thought it was dying, which was why it was leaving a part of itself behind as a memento for him. Bai Shi now has no idea how to explain to the representative of this new species, who doesn't speak the language, that this is just an exam. Bai Shi would very much like to be rescued right now. Bai Shi fully understands that the mermaid's self-healing process cannot be forcibly interrupted, or else he might suffer a nervous breakdown. Therefore, all he can do is wait until he has fully recovered. Lan Bo wrapped his arms around himself, and just then, Bai Shi said, "Damn, you haven't been in the water in so long. Your tail's really dried out. How do you do that?" Then Bai Shi unscrewed the water skin and poured water over the merman's head so he could feel a little moisture. After that, he pulled the mermaid closer to him and said, "It's okay. You don't have to curl up into a ball." However, despite all these words, Lan Bo continues to curl up into a ball while Bai Shi tries to get him out of there. Bai Shi hugs Lan Bo Yi again and tells him that she won't force him to do anything anymore. Bai Shi sadly lowered his gaze. One thought kept running through his mind. He's resisting this so much and I can't just tell him it's just a test. I'll have to take a roundabout approach. Bai Shi looked the mermaid in the eyes and asked, "Lan Bo, do you know that in emergency situations, doctors perform CPR to save a patient?" Then the guys exchanged glances, and a silence fell between them. And right after a brief pause, the guys kissed. Bai Shi thought it was artificial respiration. Bai Shi stepped away from Rusal and told him that he was now alive and well, so there was no reason to worry. Bai Shi also asked Rusal if he was feeling any better. Lan Bo looks down and then lets out a, "Huh?" Bai Shi gently approached the merman and asked him to get up and stop pretending to be dead, since he knew full well that the blonde guy was just fine. Those words stung Lan Bo. He also noticed that some parts of his tail were missing scales. Lan Bo suddenly snatched back the scale from Bai Shi, the very one he had given him just a few minutes earlier, and Bai Shi sensed the awkwardness of the situation. When he approaches the mermaid and tells her that he's actually worried about his appearance, Bai Shi also asks the mermaid not to forget to glue everything back together now. Bai Shi had one scale left. He raised his hand holding it and wouldn't let the mermaid take it. In this way, he teased his friend and asked him if he wanted to get that scale. Lan Bo was simply furious. You could tell everything from his eyes and facial expressions. Bai Shi laughed very loudly, since he had been goofing off the whole time, while Lan Bo took it way too seriously. Lan Bo himself slunk off as far away as he could. He felt uncomfortable being around Bai Shi. Bai Shi looked thoughtfully at the mermaid, recalling recent events. After that, he turned his attention back to the scale and carefully set it aside, keeping it as a memento. After that, he put it in the pocket of his outerwear. And then he turned to the man who had been standing behind him the whole time and asked him how long he had been standing there. And the man froze in surprise. Then he said, "You're really something. Did Uncle Jin ask you to help Lu Yan with his exam?" Then Bai Shi tells the guy not to make up nonsense and says he's here of his own free will. This guy figures that Bai Shi is clearly on his side, which means he definitely trusts him. Then the guy said, "But I'm more interested in something else. Where did you meet Lan Bo and how long have you known him?" Just as he asked the question, Bai Shi lit a cigarette. Bai Shi looked at the guy and said, "We've known each other for 3 years, 6 months, and 5 days." Then this guy says, 3 years ago, I was at a military exercise with my father, and there they organized a tour for us of the biochemical weapons warehouse at the 109th Research Institute. I was young and naive back then, wandering around wherever I pleased, and I accidentally stumbled into some kind of lab. Bai Shi froze and asked again, "The 109th Biochemical Weapons Warehouse?" Then he received the reply, "As long as no one noticed me, I kept running around there, and then I stumbled upon an incubator in which a spherical creature was floating, the same kind of sphere that Lan Bo had recently curled up in, with only part of its tail sticking out of it." Bai Shi asked what happened next, and he heard the reply, "They didn't cut off his tail." The guy continued his story. "It was such a long stretch that I was afraid I'd snagged on something, and one of the scientists ended up catching me after all." Vi also added, "He grabbed me and threw me out of the lab, but I could still hear that creature screaming." Bai Shi pondered these words. The thought kept running through his mind. At that time, Lan Bo had just started having mental health issues due to stress. He even slit my stomach open. Could all of this be connected somehow? Then Wei turns to Bai Shi and asks him, "Why did they do that?" Bai Shi hypothesizes that molten glass, flowing naturally under the force of gravity, forms dense, teardrop-shaped pieces of glass known as Prince Rupert's drops. While the base of a single drop like that can withstand even heavy loads, its tail is very, very fragile. And the same applies to mermaids, Bai Shi continued. When they are forced to curl up into a ball for self-healing, nothing from the outside is capable of unfurling them again. So rules Bai Shi. Vi remarked that it was all rather cruel, and then he heard Bai Shi's voice again. "How else can we conduct experiments without unwrapping him? We need to take blood and bodily fluid samples to study the seal's tolerance to various substances. It is also necessary to determine the limits of possible injuries and temperature fluctuations, as well as physical strength and abilities. All of this requires cooperation on the part of the test subject," says Bai Shi. Vi lowers her head and remarks that Bai Shi is surprisingly well informed about this. Bai Shi replied, "Not everyone is born with a silver spoon in their mouth. It's just a test, and Daddy found you an escort for protection anyway." Vi lowers her head and admits that someone else was luckier. Vi said, "Liu Yang is just the same. I don't care anymore that he's yours. I'm used to everything." After saying those words, the young man left, and later added, "Uncle Jin is overthinking things. I can lead Liu Yang to victory even without your help." Bai Shi replies that it makes sense and says he wouldn't have turned down a brain like that at 17. After that, the guy looks down sadly and says, "Back then, all I could think about was how to get revenge on him. I was constantly thinking about how I'd beat him to a pulp the next time we met." Bai Shi pondered the question. Could it be that the young man was holding something back about what had happened to him at that biochemical weapons warehouse at the 109th Research University? The trip to the location of the second mission, the hospital. The cars were speeding down the road. Bai Shi, Lan Bo, Liu Yang, and Langsing set out on a journey to carry out their mission. Bai Shi holds out his hand and asks Russell to give it to him. Lan Bo isn't quite sure what's expected of him, so he places his hand on the brunette's hand. But Bai Shi says that wasn't what it was about at all. In fact, he asked the blonde guy to give him his tail. For a moment, there was complete silence between the guys. Russell wasn't doing what Bai Shi had asked him to do. But at some point, he finally makes up his mind and very carefully hands part of his tail to Bai Shi. Bai Shi touches the tail and carefully examines the scales underneath to see if there is any damage. Lan Bo freezes and lets Bai Shi examine her, without resisting or interfering. Bai Shi noticed an unusual scar beneath the scales. It looked as though his tail had been cut off, but then it grew back. Bai Shi yanked the tail sharply again. Bai Shi does realize, after all, that for mermaids, even 10 centimeters cut off is the equivalent of a human having their legs cut off. Bai Shi knows that no matter how much the fishtail regenerates, the excruciating pain it caused will never go away. Memories flooded back to Bai Shi. Back then, the 109th Research Institute had procured countless test subjects for military experiments, and their sponsors hoped to obtain the most capable among them. After Lan Bo wounded Bai Shi, the young man was out of commission for 2 weeks, and his fighting skills were no longer what they had been before. In the end, they saw him as a punching bag and sold him for next to nothing to some wealthy man who ran an underground boxing club. In this situation, the little boy often had to resort to violence. It was simply unavoidable. It was only thanks to Liu Shanji, who recognized Bai Shi's potential, that the young man was able to escape that nightmare. Back then, everyone treated Bai Shi with the utmost care and told him not to be afraid, saying they would take him home. But Bai Shu doesn't know how Lan Bo has lived these past 3 years at this 109th Research Institute. Bai Shi sighs heavily, realizing that Rusula's life has been very hard. Then he touched his lips to her scale and kissed her, and the thought crossed the guy's mind. Wasn't this exactly what Lan Bo wanted? Suddenly, very loud music starts playing, and all the kids brace themselves in case of danger. Bai Shi holds out his gun and looks for the source of the sound. As it turned out, there was a girl behind the tree. She's a bell ringer, an Omega. Her ability is a destructive song, a song that can completely stun an opponent. Dumo, a raven and an Omega, approaches Bai Shi. His ability is Harbinger of Death. He can predict whether a target will survive the next hour. The guy walks up to him, greets him, and says, "I'm the team captain. Where are the alphas here?" Dumo asked Bai Shi if he wanted to join their team. Bai Shi then asked, "Join forces?" Bai Shi asks Dumo what the terms of such an alliance would be. Dumo grabbed the guy by his clothes and said, "We're not going to claim points for the kills, but you'll have to escort us to the Research Institute where our mission is located." Bai Shi stepped back to a safe distance and asked how he should address the stranger. Dumo grabbed Bai Shi by his clothes again and told him his name. Bai Shi said that people can just call him Bai. For some reason, Lan Bo was furious when he witnessed this scene. Bai Shi noticed this and walked closer to the merman. He asked what had happened and why he was acting that way. Could it be that he's bored? But Lan Bo looked away. He didn't really want to talk to Bai Shi. But a moment later, the merman touched the collar of Bai Shi's garment and pulled him toward him, and their eyes met. Bai Shi observed the mermaid's behavior, and it occurred to him that Lan Bo was jealous of him. Bai Shi and Lan Bo were as close to each other as possible. At that moment, the dark-haired man released a scent. Everyone present could smell these scents, as they were literally in the air. Lu Yang covered his genitals. He didn't like the smell. One of the guys shouts, asking if Lan Bo has really lost his mind, and the same guy asks Russell to put an end to all this. At that moment, Lan Bo let go of Bai Shi's clothing and looked at everyone else. Lan Bo uses his scent to overpower all other smells. He does this to make Bai Shi jealous, so that Bai Shi will pay attention only to him. Bai Shi stepped between Lan Bo and the rest of the guys. He asked them to keep their distance from Rusala. Then Bai Shi thought, Lan Bo is trying to intimidate the outsiders with force, and if he doesn't stop, these Omegas could get hurt. Lan Bo wants to show Bai Shi that he's really cool. At that moment, everyone else is feeling a little under the weather, even though they say they can get through it. Bai Shi gently patted Russell on the head and said, "I never said he was better than you." However, Lan Bo remained jealous. He looked away, feeling hurt, and continued to sit there in silence. Lan Bo continues to spread his scent everywhere, trying to outshine all the other men with it. The guy also wags his tail, making sudden jerks. He generates an electric charge and soars into the air, drawing everyone's attention. Lan Bo climbed in through the window. At that moment, Bai Shi led the entire group, saying, "Let's go. We'll get inside and help Li Yan find the hallucinogens." The guys in the lab had been searching for the right hallucinogens for a long time. Yeah, that's right. It was already late in the evening. Bai Shi finds a journal labeled Special Operations Weapons 15-13. Then he turns to Dumo and asks him to take a look at it. Dumo asks, puzzled, "What is this?" Bai Shi opens the magazine and says, "There aren't enough photos here, and since we're on the same team, I think it's very important to share information." At that moment, Dumo let out a heavy sigh, but he had no choice. He admitted that he had come across documents in the library related to Assignment C, which mentioned a certain Shinuimu. For a while, Dumo even thought that the merman Bai Shi was his target. Bai Shi touched his chin with his palm and fell deep in thought. He had deliberately kept the number of killings to a minimum, so as not to stand out during the exam. But Lan Bo's appearance was far too conspicuous. It seemed they would have to be more careful so that his movements wouldn't attract unnecessary attention. Soon, Lu Yang happily comes out to the guys and tells them the good news that he has found the very hallucinogens they need to complete the mission. Bai Shi turns to the rabbit and says, "Let me help you, otherwise you'll cut your hands and you still have to fight." The guys were very happy that the task was finally completed. Lanqing reaches out to touch Lu Yang's head and gently strokes it, while the boy smiles and says, "Considering the reward for completing the mission and the number of opponents we've defeated, we can earn 6 stars if we manage to stay alive until the end of the exam." Bai Shi heard this and asked, "How many stars do you need?" Getting through the Research Institute isn't exactly easy, so I could lead you all the way through. But I don't know how many teams are currently fighting over the 3 local weapon crates, and I'm definitely sure I won't be able to keep an eye on all of you, sweethearts. Lu Yang folded his arms and looked ahead with a displeased expression. then asked the brunette, who exactly is he calling his little ones here? And Lan Bo was only too happy to hear himself addressed that way. And as always, he was chewing on yet another object. Baisha sits down on the table and tells the kids that they're all his little ones. This makes Lan Bo even more anxious. Sweat is streaming down his face, and he starts chewing on the can even harder. Baisha approached Lan Bo and asked him if he had heard that. Baisha reflected on the fact that Lan Bo rarely reveals his possessive nature, but he knows full well just how far this fish is capable of going in his intimidation tactics. Lan Bo approached Baisha and kissed him. Baisha thought that even though this was happening in public, it wasn't a problem for him. Baisha sees nothing wrong with Lan Bo hugging or kissing him, and thereby showing that he belongs to him. Soon, the two guys stepped back and looked at each other. From the look on Rusel's face, Baisha could tell that he was indeed very angry right now. Baisha was the first to break the silence. He said, "What I meant was that these cute omegas are my little ones." Lan Bo was still on his guard. His expression betrayed his intense anger. Lan Bo interpreted these words slightly differently. To him, it seemed as though Baisha had said, "You're my sweet little omega, my baby." Lan Bo smiled. He agreed with those words, and they made him very happy. Baisha approached the merman and said that once they got home, they would have a serious talk about his behavior, while Lan Bo moved closer to Baisha. This time, the merman was very kind. Dumo said, "Since your group is already done with its assignment, will you help me out, okay, little bro?" Just then, the guy started giving off a scent. That scent made Lan Bo feel uneasy. He stood in front of Baisha as if to show that this guy belonged to him. Lan Bo looks at Dumo and says, come with me." And then the blonde guy had a totally crazy look on his face. Dumo watched the blonde man in bewilderment. Baisha said, Yes, follow him. He's the strongest, so even I'm under his thumb." Dumo watched what was happening, and at that moment, cold sweat trickled down his face. That night, the guys hopped back in the car and hit the road. Along the way, they meet a guy from a group of ghost hunters. His name is Ha So-wai, and he wished the guys good luck. However, neither Baisha nor Lan Bo paid him any attention whatsoever. They did everything they could to ignore him. Hisoe smiled broadly. It seemed to him as if they were challenging him with their indifference and complete disregard. Also, the mermaid caught everyone's attention. By that point, she was already sleeping peacefully on Baishu's shoulder. Then Hasoe said, "Your little guy has a cute face. Maybe you'll let me play with him for a bit? I'll trade him for my teammate." Baisha just shot the guy a contemptuous look. The idea didn't sit well with him at all. Baisha slowed down a bit, then smiled and said, "Switch places with me, you idiot. I'll bite you so hard you'll scream like a victim." Those words really got under Hasoe's skin. He got even angrier and gave the guys a wild look. But because he wasn't paying attention, he didn't notice himself falling into the water. A moment later, his car was completely submerged, and it slowly began to sink. Then Baisha pulled over so he could get out and see what was going on with that guy. Baisha and his team went out and looked out to sea. One of the guys said outright that there were no reports of any deaths, and it seemed they had sailed off somewhere after all. Lan Bo was the only one who could sense those guys, so he pointed to where they were and used his powers to lift them up. It turns out they were hiding underwater. However, now they have nowhere to go. They are completely at Lan Bo's mercy. Lan Bo, showing no emotion, clenched his hand tightly into a fist. With that single action, he cleared the area of enemies. Lan Bo said in an indifferent tone that they were just some kind of weeds, and then Baisha gave the guy a close look. Baisha asked the merman where he'd picked up such words, since Brother Chu hadn't taught him anything like that. Baisha asks, "Selective learning?" And the merman tries to make Chu sounds. Baisha points to the car and asks the mermaid to get in quickly. When they got into the car, Langson called out to Baisha, then asked, "Don't you want to take it easy for a bit? I don't know how many teams are left in the game, but wouldn't it be suspicious if you killed them all and took first place?" Baisha smiles and says he just happened to forget about it. Then he hugs Lan Bo and says, "First, let's find a place to spend the night. Then we'll discuss our plans for tomorrow." Dumo said that there are quite a few of them here right now. So who's going to share a bed with whom? Lan Bo glares at Dumo, thinking that he wanted to ask Baisha to sleep in bed with him. The examiner's voice can be heard. Half of the exam is over. To those of you who have managed to stick with it this far, you've worked hard. Please take a short break. In the meantime, here is a table showing the real-time rankings of the examinees. At the hotel for the exam participants, Baisha's group had gathered there. Baisha lowers his head and thinks that, thanks to the Ghostbusters team, their achievements are at least less noticeable against the general backdrop. Baisha turns to the guys and says, I can't believe that Greyhound Sniper from the Whistle of the Wind team is still alive. Be careful. I underestimated him. When the woman, who isn't approaching the front desk, asks if they have a room available, Baishu says no, and in that case, the woman offers them 2 double rooms. The guys agreed, and then Baishu asked Liu Yang, his friend, and Du Mo to all spend the night together in one room. Liu Yang turns up his nose and says he doesn't want to be crammed into a small room with someone else. Perhaps there's another vacant room in this hotel, or maybe they could offer 5 times the usual rate for a room, and then they might kick someone out who's already staying there. Baishu asks how the young gentleman has the nerve to say such things. After that, Baishu says, "This area is remote, and the nearest strategic points are far away, so they shouldn't bother us here. Let's meet at this same spot at 4 in the morning." Lanching replied that he understood everything, but the rabbit stood his ground. He didn't want things to turn out that way at all, so Lanching had to hold him back. Baisha and Lanbo found themselves together in a spacious hotel room. Everything there was very luxurious. Baisha points upward and tells the merman that he can sleep upstairs. Lanbo turns around and looks at the stairs. It's hard for him to climb places like this, so the thought of having to sleep upstairs upsets him. Baishu noticed this and suggested that the blonde guy sleep here, while he would take the spot upstairs. Lanbo buried his head in Baishu's back, as if he didn't want to let him go. Baishu was shocked. His pupils contracted and his heart began to beat faster. Lanbo soon pulls Baishu into a tight embrace and says, "You!" Lanbo wrapped his tail around the guy to make sure he couldn't get away. He also told Baishu not to move. Baishu was stunned by what was happening. He didn't know how to react. Lanbo presses even closer and says that Baishu has a high body temperature. The merman also mumbles something about how, for some reason, it's going to hurt him. Baishu thought this was the first time Lanbo had ever spoken so clearly, and his voice turned out to be much more mature than Baishu had imagined during his late-night musings. Baishu asked Russell not to get so close to him, because it's always important to keep the right distance. Baishu looked at the guy and said, "There's no suppressor here, so be careful around me. My instincts are especially sharp right now. Aren't you worried about that?" Lanbo looked questioningly at the dark-haired man. Baishu approached Lanbo and rested his face against his shoulder. Baishu said that it was all true. Baishu also added, "One way or another, you went through a lot in that compartment." Baishu didn't know the rules for creating a pet among the test subjects at the time, but he found out one day when, after training, he discovered that Lanbo was missing. A scientist approached him and said, "Your compatibility test failed. The Omega Mermaid will be sent to another compartment for breeding, and you'll be delivered a new one in just a couple of days." Baishu learned that, when breeding a new generation, the scarce test subject Omegas are paired up until they produce successful offspring. Baishu strokes Lanbo's cheek. He looks him straight in the eyes and adds, "But you're still growing up. You're so fragile. No matter what I did to you, by morning my whole bed was covered in pearls. And the others? How did they treat you?" Lanbo looked down sadly and covered the spot near his stomach with his hand. Baishu says with concern, "If only I had known what would become of you, then I would have treated you the way you deserve." Baishu asks his question again. "What about the other alphas? Did they treat you badly?" Lanbo was very upset. Tears welled up in his eyes as he recalled everything he had been through. Baishu leaned over the merman and asked him to let him take a look for any possible damage. Baishu carefully examines the merman's arm, checking for fractures. Baishu applied a little pressure to his hand to see how it would work. However, Lanbo wasn't particularly pleased with this inspection. The first thing he did was pin Baishu down with his tail, and then he loomed over him altogether. Baishu looked the guy straight in the eye and asked, "You're being pretty aggressive. Are you planning to kill me?" Baishu asks the merman to let him take off his jacket. Lanbo kept looking at the guy for a while longer. He was lost in his own thoughts. When Lanbo relaxed, Baishu took the initiative and moved closer to get a better look at him. Baishu noticed a wound on Lanbo's body. It didn't appear to be a fresh wound. Most likely, she hadn't been allowed to let it heal properly, which caused it to become inflamed and fill with pus repeatedly. Baishu now has a hunch as to why Lanbo had to come, and he anxiously asks the guy how many times this has happened. Baishu suddenly bit down hard on Lanbo's shoulder, and when he let go, he asked, "Isn't this what you deserve? You wanted to kill me and run away, but something went wrong, didn't it?" Baishu wanted to turn Lanbo into an obedient merman. However, the blonde guy doesn't like that, and he started to get really angry. The two men couldn't see eye to eye on their values. So Lanbo silently stood up and prepared to leave, leaving Baishu alone with himself. Lanbo climbs the stairs, even though it's quite a challenge for him. When Lanbo left, Baishu was left alone. He sadly bowed his head. Bai Shi decided to follow the guy. He saw an unknown spherical object on the bed. And next to the bed, on the rug, Bai Shi discovered tear stains. Bai Shi was surprised that the merman might have been crying. Bai Shi recalls seeing Lan Bo lying on a couch in the lab for the first time. The boy cried a lot too, because he didn't want to feel that pain anymore. The scientist walked up to the guys and asked, "He's a handsome Omega, isn't he? You know that the anesthesia will relieve his pain, so calm him down." Bai Shi cast a careful glance at the young man lying nearby. She noticed that the blonde man was extremely nervous. He was practically tearing the sheet beneath him to shreds, so the anesthesiologist asked her to calm him down so he wouldn't suffer. Lan Bo was so on edge that it seemed as if he might be startled by a sudden touch and would defend himself at any moment. However, Lan Bo was the first to voluntarily extend his hand to him, and this caution in every regard seemed to have remarkably narrowed the distance between them. But just as their hands were about to touch, Lan Bo abruptly pulled his hand away. Then he tore the skin between his fingers with his teeth. But he did it only so that, in the end, they could cling to each other even more tightly. Lan Bo's hands were cold then, but not icy. It felt more like a cool breeze. Bai Shi believes that it was at that very moment that he fell in love. Right then, Bai Shi was standing in the room and saw Lan Bo curl up into a ball and hide under the blanket on the bed. Bai Shi walked up to the guy abruptly and pulled the blanket off him. He shouted, "Hey!" Bai Shi touches the ball and says that it's all Lan Bo's fault. So why is he so angry then? Bai Shi realized that he should have listened to the president and referred him to the Omega Union's team of experts. They would have conducted a thorough examination and treatment. Lan Bo was back to his usual self, and now he and Bai Shi were lying there, embracing each other. Bai Shi thought this guy was so gorgeous. He figured there wasn't a single alpha who could resist a merman. Bai Shi thinks this guy is just a magnet for alpha. Bai Shi gently kisses the blonde man on the forehead and says, "Will you want to run away once we get out of here?" Bai Shi pulled the blonde man close and added, "I'd hide you in my basement and come by every day to feed you and keep you company, so no one would ever find out about you or be able to kidnap you." After that, the brunette asked, "Is that okay?" And the guys fell asleep together. It's 4 a.m. Lan Bo is the first to wake up and open his eyes. He propped his head on his hand and began watching Bai Shi intently, for he was sleeping so sweetly. Lan Bo looked at Bai Shi and thought, in the 3 years since they'd last seen each other, this little alpha had lost all his childlike innocence, and because of his constant missions, his skin had become deeply tanned. It was no longer fair and delicate like it had been when they were children. Lan Bo is a little annoyed. Be that as it may, he still thinks Bai Shi is very handsome, and besides, he's gotten stronger. Even though he's picked up a lot of bad habits, one of which is smoking and erratic behavior. Lan Bo pinches Bai Shi's cheeks. He can't understand how the once obedient and affectionate white lion cub, who relied on his sense of smell, could have bitten himself. Lan Bo noticed that the easiest thing for him to say was the phrase "xiao bai," so he tried to wake up the brunette that way. But Lan Bo just touches the boy and hugs him tightly, letting him continue sleeping just as before. Lan Bo was getting very hot, but he couldn't seem to break free from such a tight embrace. So the guy decided to take drastic measures. He hit the brunette hard, so hard that it actually knocked him back a little. Bai Shi is in a lot of pain. He touches his head and asks Lan Bo what's wrong and why he's pushing him around and getting angry again. Bai Shi shouted that he had spent the whole night calming Lan Bo with sense, but Lan Bo woke up and even hit him. Lan Bo wanted to say something, but he just couldn't bring himself to do it. Because of his helplessness, the guy was furious. It was getting harder and harder for him to control his emotions. Bai Shi wasn't going to put up with it. He pinned Lan Bo against the wall and asked him to calm down and stop getting on his nerves. Bai Shi heard a hissing sound. He was worried about Lan Bo and asked the boy, "Did he get hurt?" Bai Shi asked, "Does it hurt a lot? Hang in there for a bit. As soon as we get out of here, I'll take you to the hospital." However, Lan Bo didn't want Bai Shi's help, so he swung his tail and struck Bai Shi hard and painfully, sending him flying into the air and crashing to the ground. Lu Yang was walking by and heard the commotion. He was glad he hadn't been put in the same room as that fish, because it had even scratched the boss until he bled, which meant it was dangerous. Lu Yang approached Bai Shi and asked him if he was still alive. At that moment, Bai Shi was lying face down. It hurt him to move. Early morning, the next day, the rabbit declared that no matter who got behind the wheel, he wouldn't help. Bai Shi folded his arms and remarked that instead of all this fuss with the kids, he'd rather be sleeping right now. Dumo approached Bai Shi and asked, "Even me?" At that moment, Bai Shi was even more annoyed. Suddenly, Dumo sensed someone's presence behind him. He immediately felt uneasy and scared, and he jumped in fright. "But you're not even married. How could you?" someone asked. Bai Shi smirked and replied, "Do you have to be married to protect someone?" At those words, Lu Yang blushed deeply with embarrassment. Lu Yang cried out sharply, "Because he's a falcon, he has a tendency to grab and bite his prey, which is why he loves biting his paw so much." One of the guys said that all this time he'd thought the union president had no desire to have children at all. After all, he has a whole box at work that helps him get rid of unwanted offspring. Lu Yang took this news very hard. Suddenly, the guy's car makes a quick U-turn so they don't run into any unwelcome guests. Bai Shi drew his gun. He was ready to fire at any moment. However, silence fell once more. Only Lan Bo approached Bai Shi and said, "Kiss me?" Bai Shi was surprised that the merman was now beginning to grasp things more quickly, and had even learned to say more words. Bai Shi approached the blonde man and told him that he'd given it some thought, and decided there should be a fight first, and the rest could wait. They'd discuss it at home. Some time had passed. Bai Shi reported that the last 3 teams remained in the arena. There were 3 elevators in the building, 2 of which required a code. Since they had split up, Dumo went up the stairs first to grab the box of ammunition. At that moment, Lu Yang asked, "Then why does the assignment I accepted say that I'm looking for a camera? Are you still unhappy that our scores aren't high enough? We're in second place after all. Or are you planning to beat the Ghostbusters? Listen to me. We're not going to take on this challenge," Bai Shi said in a firm tone. Bai Shi looks at the man who is covered in ketchup and asks, "Isn't that the captain of the Ghost Hunters?" Soon, the participants hear the notification. Target 15-13 has killed He Wenyi, and everyone is surprised. Bai Shi furrowed his brow. He figured that the person at number 1513 was none other than Shi Nuimu, and that she was currently in the building. The guy urgently called everyone together for a meeting, during which he announced, "Right now, we don't have time to mess around with the monster, so here's what we're going to do." Bai Shi continued with his idea. "First, we need to protect the Ghostbusters team." Then everyone looked thoughtfully at their leader. Bai Shi goes to help the Ghostbusters team. He asks their leader to hang in there, because they'll end up in first place if he dies, and they don't need that. The commander asked the young man skeptically not to touch him, since he wasn't a doctor at all and couldn't help him in any way. Bai Shi, meanwhile, grabbed the young man by the collar and asked him if he had seen Shi Nuims here. The guy lowers his head and says he hasn't seen anyone like that. After that, he told them that some invisible force had attacked them. Soon, Captain Bai heard his name being called over the radio. He then responded and asked Dumo which floor he was on. Dumo replied that he didn't know, but he had a feeling there was someone else in the elevator.